All righty, guys. Welcome back to your third edition of Mr. Saul Talking. Hopefully, I won't go super long, but these are kind of complicated topics. But what I want to do today is talk about the motivations of imperialism. You guys did that activity in class, so hopefully these will seem kind of obvious after doing that primary source analysis in groups. Then also talk about the Spanish-American War, which is really the beginnings, many historians would argue, of the era of empire building and imperialism in the United States. So answer the three questions I'm going to ask you guys on a separate Google Doc by 7:30 on Wednesdays before Wednesday's class. So let's just jump into this. So why is the United States interested in imperialism? So keep in mind, imperialism is when a dominant country is trying to exert control of a less dominant territory or nation, typically economically or militarily, just taking the country over or governmentally taking it over. So in terms of what the United States is doing, please be reminded that the United States is not a unique country. The country, um, you know, since the birth of the colonies, was a country dominated by uh, white Europeans who, share a cultural heritage to that of, the people of England and Germany, and if you look at the history of England and Germany and France and all the countries in Europe, by 1900, they were all imperializing. So don't think the United States is not going to behave that way because they're cut of the same cloth in many ways. The United States is unique and different, but it's not that unique and different. It's going to behave much like other countries. So think about why the United States is doing this. One is there's a motivation to grow economically. And that's mainly because they want to compete with these other countries. So the one and two are kind of tied together. The economic interest is obviously in resources that the United States doesn't have due to geography and just basic temperature and climate. The United States can't have all the resources in the world, but there might be resources like sugarcane in Latin America that is of interest to the United States. You also have the opportunity to sell American resources in new colonies that are gained. Like I said, that the first two are tied together. The United States is interested in the economic benefits of imperialism because they want to compete with European countries. They see European countries doing this in Africa and in Asia, India, all these places in Southeast Asia. And they think, wow, if the Europeans are doing this, we're going to get left out if we don't start doing this. So this is a part of that drive in the late 1800s. And then there's also a popular belief at the time that the United States needs to expand militarily in order to compete on a global scale. Spoiler alert, the United States might have to fight a war against Japan at some point in, 30 or 40 years' time, which, we'll talk about with World War II, but there's an interest in getting ports and harbors, like, let's say, Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, where, what if we need to fight a war? What if we need to, have our Navy grow? And this guy, Alfred T. Mahan, writes this book about the importance of navies, and he stresses that dominant nations have good navies. And this is prevailing in the United States at the time politically, that, people in power think we need to expand our Navy, spend more money, and that means more ports, more harbors, and more of these let's go to a map real quick, more of these dang islands in the Pacific, right? So Midway Island, midway between California's coast and roughly, Southeast Asia and Japan. We need to have these places. I'm sure many of you who are like, what? Where are these places? I've never heard of any of these places. They're generally very tiny and mainly used for military use, but incredibly important to the United States at the time and still to this day, Hawaii being the most famous because it became a state. But um, there's also a belief here in white Anglo-Saxon supremacy, which is driving all of this belief in imperialism. Most imperialists, I wouldn't say most, I would say all imperialists, in some form, to maybe some stronger extent than others, believed in white supremacy. They believed that white Anglo-Saxon people of particularly in Northern Europe, England, Nordic areas of Europe, they believe that they were the superior race on Earth. And of course, that is been completely found bogus and ridiculous and not rooted in any genetic or scientific evidence. But it's a belief that they held and it led to them doing things like overthrowing the Hawaiian monarchy under the argument that, well, we can't trust these people of these regions that we're taking over to control their own destiny. They need our help because we are the superior race. That's the argument that's presented. So in places like Hawaii, where the Hawaiian monarchy is overthrown, you won't believe, but Sanford B. Dole, Dole fruit, that Dole would become the first head of the Republic of Hawaii before it became a state in 1959. So you can kind of see even in Hawaii, there's this attitude of racism. There's an attitude of, we need this for military use. We need it so we can behave like European countries. And we need it, most importantly, some would argue, for the money, that there's a growth here that can benefit the United States, which did. So, quick question. Of those motivations, what do you see as most significant in explaining why the U.S. was interested in imperializing? I know it's a long question, but just think, of those four, is there one that sticks out to you, knowing the history of the country? There's one stick out as being most important in explaining why the country was interested in imperialism. So, answer that on a separate Google Doc, and there's two more questions as we talk about the Spanish-American War. Spanish-American War is incredibly important, both because of the effects it has in terms of what we gain as a country, but also in terms of kind of pinpointing the beginning of this drive towards imperialism. So really the big year is 1898, but we'll talk about how we get to 1898. So in the 1880s, Americans start investing lots of money in sugarcane operations in Cuba. There's an economic interest of many people, and Cuba had been controlled by Spain for hundreds of years. And in fact, as you probably already know through world history, Spain had controlled the vast majority of South and Central America through the early 1800s. But by the 1890s, Spain had very few colonies. Really, in this region, it really only still held Cuba and Puerto Rico. So in 1895, the Cubans and their revolutionaries start to call for independence because they're tired of Spanish rule. They start to see other countries that were newly independent were once Spanish colonies, and they can do the same. So this leads to destruction of property, and Americans starting to ask this question of, well, what do we do? Do we support Spain? Do we support the Cuban people? And it's split. Some supported Spain because there is a belief that supporting Spain would help our business interests from being, being destroyed literally. And others argued that, hey, Cubans want independence, and we're a country founded on independence. Why can't we support the Cubans? So other things start to lead up to get Americans further to support the Cuban side of fighting for independence. One of which is people learn about what Spain was doing to Cuban revolutionaries. Cuban revolutionaries that were caught and or even associated with Jose Marti, who was the leader of the Cuban revolutionary group. They were put in concentration camps. They were, forced to starvation. Americans started to see images coming out of Cuba and were utterly disgusted and were very scared for the Cuban people. You also have newspapers who start to write about these stories. Sometimes those newspapers would kind of stretch the truth. This was called yellow journalism, where they are looking to sell papers and they're looking to drum up support to go to war against Spain and help the Cuban people. But yellow journalism is the concept. When you yellow the truth, it's when you're, let's say, exaggerating the truth. You're not exactly telling the direct truth in order to sensationalize or make a stronger point. So this is another reason why the Americans are starting to change in favor of the Cubans. And then there's one last thing, which is really that there's this major explosion of a U.S. ship in Havana Harbor in Cuba. So in 1898, the U.S. sends the USS Maine to Cuba to protect American interests in Cuba. Controversial because some might saying, hey, we're not at war with Spain. Why are we sending a warship, to a foreign country or a foreign colony? It doesn't really make a lot of sense. Well, ultimately, that's a large conspiracy that maybe the United States did it on purpose, and maybe the Spanish didn't explode the ship. And what ultimately does happen is the USS Maine does explode in Havana Harbor one night, and Americans on board die. And there's obviously people who immediately turn to Spain and say, Spain must have done it. All of these things are showing that Spain's evil. We need to go to war with Spain. The interesting thing historically is that we'll never know what happened on that night in Havana Harbor. But the evidence actually points to this just being a freak total accident and having nothing to do with Spanish mines in the harbor or anything like that. That was just a freak occurrence, and it just so happened to occur in Havana Harbor that night. But lots of conspiracy theories may, go to show that, maybe the United States purposely exploded the ship. Hard to prove. It's actually impossible to prove, but it's just one of those things that drums up the final support to get to war against Spain. So ultimately, it's the brutality of Spain, the images of these concentration camps and these awful, awful, awful things occurring on top of yellow journalism, like this article where people are expressing how awful the Spanish are, and they would often do this. William Randolph Hearst and Pulitzer, who are the two major New York newspaper owners, were trying to compete with each other and kind of created fabricated stories with this yellow journalism. But the goal, obviously, was to get people upset. And then ultimately, the U.S.-Spain explosion really is the final straw, and the U.S. declares war on Spain, one of the very few wars in American history that the U.S. government, specifically the Congress, which is how you're supposed to declare war according to the Constitution, one of the 5 wars that we actually declare in American history. The war was extremely popular. This was not a controversial decision. It was popularly supported. And it was popularly supported because the United States thought that this would be an easy victory, and it ended up being an incredibly easy victory. In fact, in the Spanish-American War, more Americans who served ended up dying from diseases that were foreign to them than died in actual combat. U.S. Dominates within a few months. People refer to it as a splendid little war, if any war could ever be. And on a side note, it leads to the rise of Teddy Roosevelt, who volunteers with a group known as the Rough Riders to fight in the Spanish-American War, which leads to him ultimately getting picked to be a Republican vice president. And then when McKinley gets assassinated, you have the rise of Teddy Roosevelt, a very, very famous and beloved, I would say now more controversial historical figure, but a beloved president and beloved progressive, despite his many faults, which I won't go into here. But the big reason why we're talking about the Spanish-American War is because the effects it has. Most importantly, there is the Treaty of Paris, which is signed, and essentially Spain agrees to give up Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States for approximately $20 million. The $20 million part isn't really significant, but Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines is super significant, one of which is, we'll talk a little bit more about Puerto Rico and the treatment of Puerto Ricans who are Americans, are born Americans. They are living in America, but of course, Puerto Rico is not a U.S. state and thus is treated differently as a territory than it is obviously the 50 states of the United States. Guamanians also experience similar issues despite a smaller population. In the Philippines, I don't want to get into that right now, but we will talk extensively about the Philippines on Wednesday. Most importantly, this also leads to the United States being a dominant global power. People look at the United States on a global stage and start to say, wow, this is a moment where you could start to see the rise of American dominance, which the United States will continue throughout much of the 20th century. And I would argue that dominance has only recently waned, post-Cold War. But super significant war, and really the beginning of this birth of empire building and imperialism for the United States. So 2 quick questions. Explain one cause of the Spanish-American War in your own words. And then lastly, do you think the U.S. was justified in entering the Spanish-American War? So in a couple, 3 to 5 sentences, a little bit more complex. Do you think that the United States was acting in good faith and had good intention to support the Cubans in fighting Spain and give them independence? Or do you think it was completely wrong of the United States and it was very selfish of the United States? We'll talk a lot more about that question. But y'all have a good day. Email me if you have any questions, and I'll see you guys Wednesday.